Good evening. We are now entering the second panel, actually the final part of our conference today. I'm thankful for your patience and hope that you will enjoy our discussion. I'm surrounded with the three outstanding panelists, and behind me is in fact the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room, tariffs. Allow me to just make a couple of remarks continuing along the same line we heard at the end of our discussion in the previous panel. My understanding, since I'm not, this is not my cup of tea, I'm not an expert in this field, but from the perspective of my perspective, when it comes to negotiation, what I see as a strategy, if there is any strategy behind this, is that President Trump wants to increase bargaining power of the U.S. using tariffs not as a carrot but as a stick, and wants to display the U.S. power globally. But this approach comes with a cost, and the recent visit or travel through Eastern Asia and what we also discussed with Europe displays the power of this approach, but also limitation of this approach. He is approved as such, and the power is acknowledged in a number of cases and countries visited, including Japan, but it's not always that way. And at the last meeting with the Chinese President Xi actually demonstrated limitation of that approach. We can even turn to Canada, saying that what was mentioned just half an hour ago, that this also demonstrates limitation of this approach. I'm this evening with three, as I said, outstanding panelists. I will introduce each of them before they are about to speak, but let me just mention their name. Rachel Thrasher is further right. Then Kelly Fay Rodriguez is just sitting next to me, and Professor Gallagher is there. We will begin with Kelly Fay Rodriguez because guest comes first. This was our internal decision. Kelly Fay Rodriguez will focus on U.S. labor trade and EU trade labor, but not just that. She is a former U.S. Special Representative for International Labor Affairs. She served as the lead diplomat for international labor policy for the Biden-Harris administration at the Department of State, and as the President's Special Representative for International Labor Affairs. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Three different ways of saying the same thing. The titles get long in the State Department, but thank you so much for hosting this conversation. Really, really great to get to talk about creatively and honestly about what's happening now and what we need to be doing and seeing and thinking moving forward. And I want to start where Ambassador Tai ended earlier, where she emphasized that Donald Trump is not the source of all change in trade, but a product of our economy and the neoliberal order and system. And I'll start with that labor in USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, as well as in our U.S. forced labor trade policies, also really were a product of the conditions and that dynamic, right, of having our political parties really struggle with how to do things differently and better, how to include different constituents, how to make sure that trade really reflected and benefited more people. And so the lessons that we learned under the Biden administration, I think it's worth reviewing a bit. We learned that we need rules that actually have consequences that are able to be implemented effectively. We learned also that we need resources to be able to have the kinds of outcomes we want in our trade policy. And one important one certainly is labor standards and decent jobs. We we also learned, and we saw, as Catherine mentioned, that under the first Trump term, the Biden administration, now the second term, we're really grappling with what does it look like to have a new economic and trade order. We saw it show up in very different ways in the labor space. In 2023, we saw more workers go on strike in the United States than we had over 450,000 workers go on strike that year. And 2 years earlier, it was about 40,000. So just enormous shifts in risk-taking for workers, right, and economic practices and patterns that we saw within our economy in the US. We saw over 1 million workers get wage increases that year from their new collective bargaining agreements, their unions negotiating for wage increases. And those examples are really important now to think about what does it look like to have, to start to craft a new trade agenda that will benefit or could benefit workers. We saw under USMCA really important enforcement, the Labor Rapid Response Mechanism that produced, for the first time in Mexico, we saw $6 million in back pay for workers. We had, for the first time, workers were reinstated who had been wrongly terminated. They were able to elect new independent democratic unions, and then were able to negotiate, in some cases, double-digit wage increases, thanks to those unions, right? This in a context where, for decades, Mexico had the lowest wages of all OECD countries. And that was a result of the new Labor Rapid Response Mechanism that, for the first time, had facility-specific enforcement and benefited from organizations on the ground being able to educate workers on their rights, and really government enforcement modeling that workers could exercise their rights. There would be space for worker organizing for the first time in a lot of places. Importantly, we had one case where Goodyear, American companies, of course, through the RRM, were involved in ensuring remediation of violation of rights in Mexican suppliers. And one case where Goodyear paid over 1,000 workers, 1,186 workers, about $4.2 million in back wages and benefits. So we're talking about a real meaningful benefit to workers, their families, and their lives that was a result of the enforcement of this agreement. And just this August, as a result of the Biden administration's enforcement in the last few years, we had the first ever U.S. trade panel decision in favor of workers. And for those of us coming at this issue from the labor space, who had seen through CAFTA-DR, the Guatemala case, and others where we had seen workers who could be murdered because they were trying to organize a union, that the trade model didn't work to have accountability or justice for them, and that the economic consequences meant that low standards could continue to prevail. Low labor standards, precarious labor standards could prevail, and frankly, violation of labor rights. So really, really important shift here. And I had the chance to be a part of seeing the transformation in the trade policy space from 2020 to 2023, where, again, both parties really in Congress and in the private sector really had to undergo a culture change of thinking differently about doing business, making sure that starting to think about how they would reform their practices to accommodate and consider worker standards in their supply chains domestically and internationally. And that really wouldn't have happened without a series of events that I know that the ambassador had elaborated earlier in her opening. We have found some areas for growth within the USMCA experience. The scope of the rapid response mechanism is limited to certain sectors, and the conditions for which violations can be addressed don't include right now wage and hour issues and occupational health and safety. So certainly the full spectrum of internationally recognized worker rights could be considered, and Canada and the US application for labor rights violations is basically non-existent right now. But importantly, another lesson we've learned is really, I mentioned earlier about the resources. Congress passed the USMCA with an implementing legislation allocating $180 million of US taxpayer money to support worker rights awareness and education and enforcement in Mexico. And this went together with the Mexican government's decision to pass labor law reform that transformed their system of labor justice. Those funds supported the work that US unions were doing in partnership with Mexican workers and unions, and unfortunately was cut off during this administration before the end of those funds could be concluded. This is where I think we are seeing a real obstacle in terms of being able to even think about trade policy that could benefit workers. We've been really lucky to have career officials at USTR, particularly in the labor office, that are continuing to do a lot of the work that was begun under the last administration, but without the capacity of the interagency of folks who understand labor rights and how it connects to trade and economics and how to engage with counterparts in Central America and Mexico and other places around the world, it really limits the potential and the impact of the US, trade agenda to really address labor standards abroad as well as domestically. The other lesson learned is really around the forced labor and trade space and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and Section 307 of the Tariff Act, which prohibits the import of goods made wholly or in part by products made of forced labor. And both of those policies for several years have been since the WRO's, since Section 307's loophole was closed and started to be utilized to block goods made with forced labor from entry into the US market. These laws have been seen by labor advocates internationally and human rights advocates as some of the most effective. It disincentivizes and deters forced labor in specific supply chains, but also state-imposed forced labor. And under those provisions, the US has been able to block $27.6 million worth of goods that have been made with forced labor. $1.46 billion worth of goods in 2023, 1.75 billion in 2024, and in the last 3 years, a total of 3.21 billion in value of goods made with forced labor. Again, the most important and sort of impactful deterrent for forced labor that we've seen globally in any other market. And this is important because we also are seeing an increase in forced labor in global markets. The ILO reported in 2024 that 27.6 million people are subjected to forced labor. That has been on the rise. We're seeing increasingly in the private sector as well as in developed countries. And so continues to be an important priority for the labor movement and a key part of any kind of worker-focused or worker-centered trade agenda. So the lessons learned again, facility-specific models that work, ensuring major importer companies and brands are involved. The first case out of the USMCA rapid response mechanism under the last administration was a self-initiated one against General Motors for violations in their Silao facility. We've seen how the whole of government approach to trade policy following the framework set out by the USTR can be effective, and that it really requires robust culture change. In leading the State Department's labor work, spent a lot of time doing internal education for econ officers at embassies around the world to educate them on what our trade policies and what the mandate was from the White House to bring workers to the table, to make sure that we had, that it wasn't just companies dictating and involved in the government-to-government discussions. I know the earlier reference to the US-EU TTC was one of the models, but there were many places where workers for the first time were brought into the trade policy discussions and policy making. And we also learned the need to have hard tools to prevent and deter violations and practices that drive practices that hurt workers, and instead be able to shift business practices and to be able to support governments with those changes. Now, under Trump 2.0, we are seeing that aspects of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, labor provisions continue to be moving forward. There's cases continue. The panel decision that came out in August, while it started earlier on, continued and wasn't blocked or stopped. However, the gutting of labor foreign assistance, which has been estimated to be well over $700 million essentially from between January and May of this year, really is going to impact, again, the ability of the Trump team's trade policy makers to be able to enforce and inform an agenda that would benefit workers. We did see in the recently published the Malaysia and Cambodia agreements some important language around forced labor, particularly in Cambodia, making sure the language requires Malaysia to have to create its own forced labor market ban within 2 years, and Cambodia to do the same, but there's not a time limit. That language is very important to have and worth trying to implement. However, it's going to be incredibly difficult without staff in the Department of Labor to help do the technical assistance for those countries and their labor ministries to enforce, as well as the infrastructure within the State Department and USAID to help fill in some of the gaps as well. And now I'll talk a little bit about the due diligence law, and this is where we're seeing another real contrast and contradiction with Trump 2.0's trade agenda. So while the president and his cabinet claim to be making these decisions on behalf of American workers, they are taking these actions that are really detrimental and destructive for an American economic agenda that could benefit workers, right? They're gutting the resources necessary to make sure workers don't have to compete with forced labor overseas. And in the US-EU discussions, the language there actually is really destructive in the sense that in the targeting of the EU's due diligence law. In 2024, the European Union passed, after several years of deliberation, a corporate accountability law. It's known as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And it aligns with the UN guiding principles and the OECD the OECD guidance for multinational enterprises, and it basically requires companies to investigate within their supply chains for risks of abuse, risk of violation of human rights and environmental risks, to take action to mitigate those risks, and then to remediate. They've got to establish grievance mechanisms within their supply chains. So this is applying to their supply chains in Europe as well as overseas. And it requires a risk-based due diligence that companies identify, prevent, mitigate, and remedy adverse human rights impacts in their operations and supply chains. It includes adopting a due diligence policy, integrating it into business practices, and conducting meaningful stakeholder engagement. And that is where labor unions in Europe and overseas are really eager and interested to see the impact that this can have. Unions are really viewing this new corporate accountability policy as potentially more impactful if done right and well, and if it remains intact, than what we've been able to do in the US in our trade policies. Because for so long, companies have not had to not address violations in their supply chain, but not even had to look or consider what kinds of risks exist there in their supply chain. So the EU CSDDD directive includes labor rights. It provides, it requires companies to provide public reporting, and it also includes a civil liability provision where folks, whether environmental or human rights violations, victims of those violations could bring civil charges against companies for failure to comply. The scope is for companies with at least 1,000 employees and with a turnover of 450 million euros, and large non-EU companies that have 450 million euro turnover in the EU. These are about 900 companies that would apply, so really only we're talking about the biggest companies operating in the European Union. And again, applies to their own operations, their subsidiaries, and their chains of activities. The law requires EU member states to transpose the directive this year, but unfortunately, earlier this year, there have been efforts to dismantle that directive, known as the Omnibus legislative initiative. A new report that came out just a couple of weeks ago from Somos, an NGO, their research found that ExxonMobil had been one of the primary funders of the lobbying efforts for this law. Before the EU had discussed or contemplated an omnibus, Exxon was funding lobbying efforts in Europe to reverse this directive. And the report also talks about how their leadership has been close with the Trump administration, and as a result, in August and July, we saw the language from the US-EU agreement directing essentially the European Union to reverse the civil liability and ensure that U.S. companies attempt to ensure the U.S. companies are not subjected to rigorous regulation. So here we have, U.S. trade agreement language with the European Union that attempts to dismantle their legislation that, again, took years to pass, that involved engagement from stakeholders, including trade unions. The AFL-CIO and the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, have come out against it, and we're going to see in coming weeks how the Parliament addresses it. But really, really important times to have solidarity amongst labor movements and advocates to ensure that these important directive efforts continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, because we got the insight from a labor perspective, since we not addressed this so far. I'm ready to turn to the next panelist, Professor Gallagher. who promised to be thought-provoking. I hope that you will stick to your promise. Professor Gallagher, many of you knows him. Professor Gallagher is Professor of Global Development Policy at the Pardee School of Global Studies and the Director of the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. I think this is enough. Everything else you can find on this green bio sheet. Please.
Thanks, Ambassador, and thanks, Professor Caruso, for getting the band back together. I'm a little cranky that we're doing it over again. But last time it was over in the law school with a bunch of legal scholars and a couple recovering economists like myself. This time is better because there's more students and you folks of the future who can vote some of this stuff in. So I will try to make 3 points that I thought were going to be super provocative, but the ambassador started out with the first one. One is that Donald Trump's policies are not the are making the situation worse, but the trade and investment regime has been dysfunctional for a long time. That's point number one. Number two is that Trump's policies are making it worse. Number three, I'll try to outline some things to make it better and put us on track. So number one, that the global trade and investment regime has been underperforming and been dysfunctional, in my opinion, and in most sort of academic circles for about 40 years, and for different reasons in the global north versus the global south. In the global north, to me, it's largely a distributional issue where the gains from trade have not been distributed to everybody and there hasn't been subsequent investment of the proceeds, whereas trade and investment treaties in the global south stunted their growth because it required a number of provisions that if you try to adhere to them at a lower level of income, you can never reach the kinds of economic growth and prosperity that we have here in the United States. So let me get into those for a second before I get to my second point. So if you ask any economist, I'm a recovering economist, when the New York Times calls us up and they say, is trade liberalization good? We say yes, but, and by the time we get the B out for but, they hang up because they hear what they wanted to hear. But what we usually say when we say but is, well, if it meets the assumptions that we have, and if the gains to the winners are used to compensate the losses to the losers, then a trade deal is great stuff. And that is the problem here in the United States, is that many of the assumptions that we put in classrooms on the blackboard to make a trade deal work for everybody don't hold. And number two, even though we've reaped incredible gains in the United States from the trade and investment treaties that we've had, we haven't compensated those losers. So what do I mean when I say that a trade deal has winners and losers? Well, you negotiate a deal with some other country, right? And the idea is, hey, I want to specialize. We've heard this in the earlier panels, and what I have a comparative advantage in, right? The things that you could be the most productive in. But you have to make a deal with the country on the other side. There might be something that they can do relatively more productive than you. And so that's where the gains actually come from. If you stop doing things that you're not so productive in and import it, and start to focus on things that you're more productive in and export it, the idea is what you export, you're going to get more market share in some other country that you're negotiating these deals with in those sectors where you're the most productive in, and in the ones where you're not so productive in, you're going to import this stuff. You're going to import the stuff, right? And so by definition, if I am exporting more to a particular country, then there's going to be more profits and perhaps more employment and perhaps at least room to bargain for higher wages in those particular sectors. But in those sectors where you have to compete with others, those by definition are going to contract. And in the United States, that's really been the comparative advantage over the past couple decades, has been in high-skilled services industries, education, insurance, health, and finance. And what we've lacked in productivity relative to other countries has been manufacturing. And so folks like us here in Boston and in biotech, there's been incredible expansion over the past 30 years, but there's been significant contraction when it comes to the lower skilled manufacturing that we've had across the United States. Those folks have been the losers, and they were abandoned by both parties, especially the Democratic Party, that was really the party of the working class. We mentioned Roosevelt earlier, but over the past 25 years, those folks did not really get much help until the Biden administration came along. The estimates that academics see is what the benefits have been for the United States in terms of trade liberalization over the past couple decades have been about $2.4 trillion. That's been the total benefit over the course. And there's been about 4 million jobs that you can say have been lost directly related to these trade deals. Now, some of the think tanks in DuPont circles say, yeah, who cares about those 4 million people, because we created 30 million net jobs during the same period since the beginning of the GATT till now. But those jobs that we created, biotech in Boston, derivatives traders in New York, software engineers in Silicon Valley, are not things that you can automatically lose your job with a high school degree where you were able to own a house and be part of a union and have great benefits. You are not at 57 years old when you lose your job in Michigan. You're not coming to Boston to work in a biotech. You're not going to New York to work in finance. Worse than that, most of those pockets were whole factories that had to close down, or whole clusters of industrial clusters that had numerous different factories. And so not only did those individuals lose their job, but the people who cut their hair, the people who work at the restaurants there, and it just decimated whole counties all across the United States, which not only makes you lose your job and reduce your income, but it had a huge impact on their housing prices, because you used to be able to have a high school degree, get a union job in a manufacturing place, and own a home. And a lot of these folks refinance those homes to expand and put their kids through college and so forth. Not only did they lose their job, they lost the value of their home. So even if they did have the skills to be able to go work for biotech, they wouldn't be able to move because they had a huge saddle of debt on their backs. And we assume on the blackboard that labor is perfectly mobile, right? That this person in Michigan can go get a job in Boston, New York, or in Silicon Valley, and that's obviously not true for the economic reasons of the housing bust that happened according to it, and the mismatch in the skill sets. So what did they do? What are the 3 largest private employers in the United States? Walmart, Home Depot, and Amazon. Most of those jobs, although it's over the past few years there has been some organizing, and these folks do have, their benefits are improving, but they generally have not had anything like the kinds of benefits of these folks who lost their jobs. And so basically you lose your job in an industrialization position and you go work for half the wage with half the benefits selling imports to other Americans, because that's basically what Walmart, Amazon, and Home Depot are. They sell things that are made in other countries to the rest of the world. So these folks felt abandoned, especially by the Democratic Party. Because, as was alluded to earlier, until the last administration, the Democrats and Republicans were basically in lockstep on most of this stuff. That, I should say, most deals only pass by 2 or 3 votes. I think NAFTA was like 12 or something like that. So it was almost always the majority of Republicans and a small group of Republicans from what was called, Democrats from what was called the Democratic Leadership Council, the John Kerrys, the Clintons, and so forth, who embraced what Ambassador Ty referred to as more of a neoliberal picture of how to deal things in the 20th century. There's an important paper that came out just last year in the American Economic Review by Choi et al., and it found that those counties in the United States that had the largest employment losses due to NAFTA were all Democratic counties in the 1990s, and they all voted for Trump. And so that's an event study that shows that these folks were Democrats, but they saw themselves as abandoned because they didn't get any help in this particular situation. So that's the take for me on what led to this, what led to Trump coming into office, and what led to the Biden administration having a different view. I should actually say that Joe Biden himself in the Obama administration had a very different view. Him and his chief economist, Jared Bernstein, clashed a lot with Larry Summers over the TPP. and the European one, yeah, thank you, which were on some levels the epitome of the sort of bad trade deals, but Biden lost out in those conversations in the White House, but was able to rectify it partly when they came to office. So that's the problem in the global north, is that we had these incredible gains, but we abandoned the losers, and they they did act during an election, and they asked for something drastically different, and they got it. In the South, it's been different. Research shows, first of all, that the gains from trade, 3/4 of them over the past 30 years, went to the global north. And only 1/4 of the gains went to countries in the global south, but those went to highly elite sectors that were very connected to some of the biggest firms in the global north. Basically, what the deals allowed it to do were the most powerful firms in the global north were allowed to move around the world pretty much footloose, and so if you could connect to those firms, you could capture and ride on the coattails of some of those gains. But in large part, many countries in the global south didn't see much of the materialization of those gains, because many of the things that are in trade treaties aren't about trade, right? Until a couple of years ago, until this year, most trade was in its tariffs were already very, very low. In the developing world, less than around 15%, and in here in the low single-digit percents. There's always a weird outlier, oranges in Texas, bras in New York, but in general they were super, super low. So why did countries want to have these agreements to begin with? Not because of the tariffs in them, because of a new term that was created in the US and in Europe in the 1990s, which are called non-tariff barriers, which were countries' environmental laws, countries' labor laws, their intellectual property rules, their financial regulations that big firms in the global north saw as barriers to getting more market share in the global south. So to sign on to a trade deal with the United States, and I should say this goes way beyond the WTO, which the WTO doesn't go as deep, because countries in the global south, the WTO, unlike the other two Bretton Woods institutions, one country's one vote. And so whereas the United States under the IMF or the World Bank can really ram through their policies and other countries don't really have much of a say, it's harder to do that under the WTO. And so I think it was mentioned the Singapore issues and so forth when the US and the West in the early 2000s really tried to push a much deeper agenda of this deregulation in the global south. They basically backlashed and slowed down the WTO. But Robert Zoellick, who was your predecessor as a USTR, he didn't like this, and he came up with a new policy for the United States, which he called competitive liberalization. Let's use the US market share and pick off smaller countries and say, you will lose access to our country if you don't open up your intellectual property rules, your financial system, loosen your labor and environmental laws, and things of that nature. And they were pretty successful. There's thousands of free trade agreements like NAFTA and bilateral investment treaties that overlap across the world that go much, much deeper than the WTO. And so premature deregulating of your financial system, premature use of US kind of intellectual property rules has played a huge role in what's been referred to by UNCTAD and Danny Roderick and others as premature deindustrialization in the global south. Here we built up an industrial class and then it eroded. In the global south, they never had a chance to build up that with a handful of exceptions, obviously, in East Asia, mainly by countries that bucked the trend in a lot of this free trade. If you have to open up and deregulate your financial system, you're going to have financial crises over and over again. If you're not able to try to absorb technology and information from the global north and help your firms get built up, you can never build the industry yourself, which is why, especially in Africa and Latin America, even though there's been so much trade liberalization and so much foreign direct investment, but neither place has grown in per capita terms more than 1% a year since 1980. Whereas in East Asia, countries that have only used the WTO and I would say have violated the spirit, but not necessarily the letter every time, has been really the only growth pole in the world economy by doing exactly opposite of what you're allowed to do under these treaties. I should say there's also a global problem with them, and that was alluded to earlier, is that the idea, especially with the WTO, is that you're not including any of the social cost to workers or the environment in the prices of everything. And so if you're liberalizing trade in an environment of no regulations, then you're going to implicitly subsidize the bad stuff. There's a great article in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by Joseph Sapiro from the economics department at UC Berkeley, which estimates that since the WTO started, that the WTO has implicitly been subsidizing to the tune of $200 to $400 billion annually fossil fuels, which has led to 2.5 gigatons per year, or 3.5%, 3 to 5% of all of the global emissions, just in the flawed design of the WTO. So point number one, things were bad before Trump came. That's partly why Trump was elected, because he told folks he would do something that they thought the Democratic Party was going to do for them. Point number two, Trump's making it worse, not making it better. Okay, first, he's obsessed with bilateral trade deficits in goods, not in services, even though the majority of our economy runs on services engines, and the majority of people are employed by services. And it's not a very economic way he's thinking about it. We know that the formula for this was partly created by ChatGPT, and that's just the economic component of it. Obviously, a lot of it is not economically driven. Brazil the United States has a surplus with Brazil, but they have high tariffs, just because it's more political than it is economic. Secondly, these guys have done some of their. Somebody asked a question about the macroeconomics and the dollar and so forth. So these guys have actually done their homework, and they realize if you do raise tariffs, that creates less demand for other countries' goods, which is going to make those countries' currencies depreciate and the US dollar appreciate, and that would cancel out the impact of the tariffs. And so this is one of the reasons why the Trump administration is trying hard to debase the dollar. He's been pushing Powell to reduce interest rates, right? If you reduce interest rates, there's more dollars there. It's going to make it relatively weaker, and attacking them in general, right? The interest rates have not had a huge impact because the tariffs have countervailed that. But the uncertainty that Trump has caused by being a taco and changing his mind every 2 minutes and really creating a lot of worry about the integrity of the rule of law in the United States actually is having downward pressure on the dollar and making investors be really concerned. And there's no better indicator of that than looking at the price of gold, right? The price of gold is shot over; it's above $4,300, it's always usually the safe haven is the U.S. dollar. It's the flight to safety. But now that's been so jeopardized, people have been putting their money into the dollar. Now, the United States does have a legislation that we often pass to try to compensate the losers. It's called trade adjustment assistance. But unfortunately, and that is after a trade deal, there's usually a bill that comes across later that will extend benefits, health benefits to people who lose their jobs and so forth. But with all due respect to those congresspeople who have passed these over the past couple decades, is that trade adjustment assistance has been more to gain a few votes for the trade deal than to literally try to compensate the losers and make up for a lot of these losses. And as the former U.S. Senator from Ohio, Sherrod Brown, has said, you can't compensate certain things about people's livelihoods. Right? It is a huge mental health crisis to lose your job as somebody who's practically an engineer with a high school degree working in a manufacturing place who can put his whole family through school and send them to college and own a home, to have to be wearing a smock at a Home Depot, making a quarter of the revenue with a quarter of the benefits. And so you can't buy that. You can't buy that pride and livelihood back with any dollar. The only thing you can do is to reinvest in the country to give these people better opportunities, not to leave them kicking for what they've had. These tariffs have been illegal. I don't want to get into that because Rachel's a legal scholar. But when it comes to I lost the thing here. bilateral trade deficits are bad. He's been talking down the dollar, which is a real problem for the U.S. economy. And he's been attacking some of our best exports. Like I said, we actually have a surplus in high-tech services, in education, health, finance, and so forth. But as we know here in education, he's been attacking the educational system, and his last budget is an absolute gutting of the last vestiges of public investment in the United States. I should say since 1980, trade has increased by a factor of 10, and the financial system has increased by a factor of 40, okay? But total investment in the United States has not changed. In 1980, we invested about 22% of GDP in investment, capital, infrastructure, and so forth. It's the same exact what it is in 2023. The only thing that has changed is that the labor share of income has reduced. So we've created this huge financial system. We've increased trade by a factor of 10, but we're not investing any of the proceeds, and labor is doing worse off. They tried something new, and he's making it worse for them. One last little statistic on the Global South. A great new study just came out from ODI, a think tank in London, which shows that the combined impacts of Trump's tariffs on the Global South are something like $122 billion worth of losses in the Global South. To put that into context, when the World Bank modeled if we got to full global trade liberalization in the entire world, it's about the same amount, right? So we're basically taking that away. Okay, what to do? 3 things. One for the United States, one for the Global South, one for the world. To do this in the United States, like Ambassador Tai, I would agree, tariffs are not evil, but they're stupid if that's all you use as a policy tool. They're very blunt. They make Americans pay. We are paying, our companies are paying for these tariffs, and our consumers are paying for these tariffs. Okay, so I would be more selective like the Biden administration was. There were a couple sectors where we thought that there's no way that we could compete and that we wanted to try to focus on: high tech, green energy, the new climate economy, and so forth. But they just didn't put tariffs in place and say, oh, let's just see things materialize. They also had an incredible investment strategy to invest in those communities, to invest in the education and the technologies to be able to get the country to try to get on that technological frontier. There's no corresponding investment plan in the United States besides the president trying to bully a couple firms to open up some businesses, which they will be because they're being bullied, but they're not going to revive manufacturing jobs in the United States. So number one is a massive public and private investment agenda that would have to go through very selective and not across-the-board tariffs. Number two, alluded to by yourself, would be more focus on wage-led growth, not just supply-side growth. We need to increase the minimum wage, increase bargaining power of workers to be able to raise wages, because when people have more money, they purchase more things, and that makes your economy grow. And third, we need to renegotiate our trade treaties. We can't have the same model, which is very hypocritical right now. The U.S. can do whatever it wants, but many countries in the Global South are subject to these 2000 treaties, even though the WTO is stifled. There's been more cases against countries in the Global South through these treaties in the past couple of years than there ever has been. So what does the Global South do? Now, I know that the first instinct is to retaliate, right? When a bully punches you in the face, you want to kick him where it counts. But unfortunately, that actually hurts you more than it hurts the bully. If countries are going to, especially individually, if countries are going to retaliate with higher tariffs, that's going to inflict even more costs on you and on your firms. And number two, you don't know what this bully's going to do. This guy is very unpredictable. So on top of inflicting costs by putting higher tariffs on your own country and restricting goods from the United States on your own country, who knows what the president might do? He might ratchet your tariffs up to another 60%. I mean, just look what he's done with China over and over again. It's you've got to be careful about it. If I was going to say anything about retaliation, what I would recommend is the establishment of customs unions, where countries could have a common reduction in their tariffs with each other, but to have a common external tariff against the United States. So they would have to pick off a whole region rather than one country. But I'm still a little, I'm not such a huge fan of retaliation. What I'm a fan of is build something better than what the U.S. and the West did on their end. It's very different than it was when we started all this stuff, when the United States and the West was about 78% of the world economy. Right now, the global South is 78% of the world economy. And so they have more leverage, and we really learned that with China a couple of weeks ago when the Trump administration tried to get there and tell them to do this, that, and the other thing, and China said, well, we've got more leverage over you than you have over us. If the global South acted like China did last week, they'd have a lot more leverage with the president than they do right now, which they're just scared and hope that the phone doesn't ring and just don't want to do anything. And so what would they do? One, create more South-South trade agreements that don't include the U.S. and that try to have a better model of what these deals should look like. I'm encouraged last week the ASEAN and China signed a trade deal, which is much better. The CPTPP is a terrible agreement. That was the epitome of the sort of neoliberal, although when the Asians did take it on, the first thing they did was strip out most of the intellectual property stuff that the U.S. had put in the version of it. So I would have much more building your own treaties, and then if the United States, as the ambassador said, grows up and wants to get engaged in the multilateral system, they need to sign on to what the other 74% of the world economy has already agreed on, rather than trying to bully its way into itself. The last thing I'll say on a global level is that perhaps there are ingredients for a new multilateralism now that the global North has realized that these things aren't so great for them either. Right? The global South has really been critical of a lot of these deals for a long, long, long time. But the global North, now that there's a huge swath, basically the working class in Europe and the United States, has really seen that these things have not helped them, that there's a real constituency. There's now a north of the South and a south of the North. And that more cross-border collaboration across this could be able to get us to, when the time comes, to a negotiation that'll help us look for a better set of treaties. And I draw inspiration from 1944. Right? The world realized in 1944 that the gold standard was an austerity straitjacket on the rest of the world, and we needed to renegotiate a series of agreements to make sure we had what was called embedded liberalism, where markets were important, but they were goals toward full employment and the societies that we wanted. But coming in the 1980s, the world shifted to markets being an end in of themselves. We've seen what has happened now when markets as an end of themselves, that the people on the planet have suffered. And now I think there is a global understanding that we went off the rails, as Danny Roderick says. What do you call it? I forget. Hyperglobalization has really made us all worse off, except for a handful of powerful interests. But I'll end where Ambassador Tai alluded to earlier, is that we're going to have to actually organize and confront some of these powerful interests. We heard from the first talk earlier today how the pharmaceuticals industry really watered down the TRIPS waiver, but even at the end of the day, they still complained about it, despite the fact that they got $18 billion in what might have been the greatest industrial policy the United States ever had, which was Operation Warp Speed, which created a vaccine in the quickest time that you ever went. And the fact that these firms, after being handed $18 billion from the United States government, were worried that they might lose tens of millions of dollars in Africa is something that we need to confront.
Thanks. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor Gallagher. Insightful and comprehensive. Since we are running again, behind our schedule, this doesn't mean that you have to actually shorten your presentation. I'm turning to the last presenter today. It's Rachel Thrasher. She's a researcher with the Global Economic Governance Initiative and serves as a team lead for the Trade and Investment Rules workstream. Rachel, please, the floor is yours, and then, don't be under time pressure.
Okay, Thank you. I am cognizant of the fact that you all have been sitting here for a long time. One of the benefits of going last is that I don't have to say maybe every single word. Many of them have been said already, and so I'm going to sort of sit back and take the role of a law professor, which is one of the hats that I get to wear occasionally, and talk about some of the things that Professor Gallagher here just recently hinted at, which was the legality of the policies that the Trump administration is engaged in. And of course, this is a lovely picture of the tariffs that were introduced. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about not just the tariffs, but about some other policies that, again, begin before Trump. And I think that's been a theme of today, that this is that attempting to protect U.S. industry is not new with this Trump administration. It is a little bit more erratic, and there are some difficulties with the particular implementation right now. But it isn't the first time that the U.S. has done things and introduced policies to protect their industries, and for many of the good reasons that we've talked about already. So I just want to talk about some of these rules. We've talked about, we've heard people talk about non-discrimination, about most favored nation treatment, and about the tariff binding. So these things have already been introduced, but I just want to lay them out a little bit more clearly for those of us in the room that aren't as familiar. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, already been mentioned, Article 2, requires the U.S. and other WTO members to agree to bind their tariffs at the product level at a certain ceiling, and not to raise their tariffs above that ceiling. These tariff bindings have been highly effective. They began under the GATT negotiations back in 1947 and have been progressively liberalized, progressively lowered trade barriers ever since. And as Professor Gallagher also mentioned, we have a bunch of free trade agreements, I think somewhere around 400 or so in effect in the world today, where countries further lower their tariffs and bind them at lower rates, so that the U.S. rates, especially with respect to its nearest trading partners, are effectively at zero, although we heard earlier that the average U.S. tariff rates were about 2.5% prior to recent changes. So that's the first rule. The second is a national treatment rule, and that is a rule within the World Trade Organization agreements, within the GATT and other agreements there, that where the U.S. and other WTO members agree to treat products from all their trade partners on equal footing with like domestic products. And that includes not just products, because we also have national treatment for investors, and we have national treatment standards for services. And so all of these bound and enforced with some particularities, and each country has their own schedule of bindings. But what this is it goes beyond tariffs, and it talks about behind the border measures, so that countries are required to treat imported products the same as their like domestic products in their taxation and their domestic regulation. The third sort of pillar that we see under the WTO in particular is this most favored nation treatment, which has already been mentioned, and that is that you have to treat all your trade partners the same. So all the products that are coming in from various trade partners have to have the same tariff treatment, and that also applies to behind the border treatment, taxes, internal taxes, and domestic regulation. These are sort of the three core, what I think of as the core pillars of the international trade regime. There are many other really important rules that govern the trade policy that the US and many other countries deploy. One thing I want to add to this is that there are additional standards in investment treaties, and again, Professor Gallagher mentioned investment treaties. There's something on the order of 3,000 of them around the world today. The U.S. Usually incorporates them into their free trade agreements, and so those investment treaties further require countries to treat foreign investors with what we call fair and equitable treatment, which is a really vague and yet extremely well-used standard in investor-state dispute settlement, whereby a foreign firm can sue their host country where they feel like the regulation has had an inequitable effect on their bottom line. So foreign firms are able to then sue countries under this. So why do these rules matter? Okay, why do these, that's just one of the standards in the investment treaties. We can talk about more of them later, and if you want to reach out to me and have more conversation, we can do that too. Why do these rules matter? Well, let's just talk about them as applied to the US policies recently. So if you talk about the tariffs that have been introduced in so-called Liberation Day and other tariffs that have been negotiated on a bilateral level, they clearly violate US commitments at the World Trade Organization. I think that's fairly well established. It's not particularly surprising. I do want to say, except there are exceptions in these global trade rules and investment rules, and those exceptions include a national security exception. And so what you often see in conversations and discourse about the US tariffs is that they're for the purposes of national security. So one example that I was reading about today is the US had made a particular point to unexempt softwood lumber from its initial list of exemptions from the 10% base rate. So that's the 10% base rate is the sort of a global rate that the administration is applying to all trading partners with, obviously, as we've talked about, lots of bilateral negotiations. So softwood lumber and wood products was one of the exempted groups of products. It was unexempted in part because it became, it's a particularly sensitive product in US-Canada trade relations. And it's been a contentious issue between those two countries for many, many years. But what you see in their statement, in the statement about why they are unexempting it, is all national security. This is essential to national security. This is our national security interest. This is because of national security. So that is the major exception that the US is relying on to take these steps, which are clearly in contravention of the original intention of the WTO rules. So there's that. But going back behind the tariffs that have just been introduced, as we've already learned, that the posture that the US is taking is a new one, but it's not so new as to have begun in January of 2025. It's a new one starting perhaps with Trump version 1, perhaps even before that, where you're starting to see an increased interest in, and well, first of all, an acknowledgement of what Ambassador Tai mentioned, which was that there's something wrong with this software, which I think is a great analogy. There's something wrong with this software, this code that we've built into trade and investment treaties. It's not having the outcome that we wanted. And so the outcomes that Professor Gallagher just mentioned in terms of the polarization, in terms of the lost jobs, in terms of the developmental, the increasing inequities in development across the global south and within global north countries. All of these things there was started to become a change in the discourse, a change in the view of how the neoliberal approach had been going. And so we start to see this move. We saw some initial so high-profile tariffs that the initial Trump administration imposed, in particular against China on solar panels. So what was that about? Well, the U.S. was receiving a ton of Chinese solar panels, and it was squeezing out U.S. solar panel producers, and it was hurting the U.S., that particular industry in the U.S. And so the U.S. made the decision to put tariffs. Now, was that effective? Well, those solar panel tariffs stayed on through at least part of the Biden administration, and it's not entirely clear to me how much. Perhaps Ambassador Tai can speak to that a little bit more. But they stayed on for a while, and so what we had is that we did increase our jobs in the solar industry, in part because of these tariffs. Now, there's also evidence that China was able to circumvent those tariffs by sending, solar panels through Thailand, through Malaysia, through Vietnam. So it's not a perfect system, but the U.S. did impose those tariffs early on for the purposes of protecting industry for some of the same concerns that we've already been talking about today. Another really important example is under the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, that wasn't a trade act per se, but it had trade implications because one of the major things that it did was it tried to reshore manufacturing of particular sectors, in particular in the electric vehicle sector. And so what that meant is that there was a provision, there was a component of that law that was called local content requirements or local content incentives. And those incentives create backward and forward linkages within the economy. They build up jobs. They produce some of these desires, and they can accompany things like tariffs in order to build up an industry where there was not one, or protect an industry that is perhaps nascent and needs protection from international competition in the short term. So these are policies that the US has deployed, all of which are, at least on their face, inconsistent with the global rules on some level. Local content requirements, much more than tariffs perhaps, have been criticized and struck down at the WTO time and time again. And that goes for everyone who's tried to put them in place. So is this a problem, right? So is this a problem that the global trade rules are inconsistent with US policy, trade policy, and policies that are trade related? One way to think about this is that, well, we've seen that there's a problem, and that was something that Ambassador Tai was mentioning earlier. We've seen there's a problem. This is not having the outcome that we were hoping to have. So it's okay for us to see there's a problem and change the way we're doing business, change the way we're engaging in these trade relationships. And in fact, one sort of idea that I've heard is that as the US is starting to realize, as the global north is starting to realize that maybe these rules, the neoliberal approach, wasn't very effective, that might provide some policy space, and I think Professor Thomas mentioned this too. This might expand policy space for other countries who are trying to do some of these developmental interventions or developmentalist interventions that they've been wanting to do for many, many years, for decades. So that's a possibility. There is a little bit of a concern that I have with completely disregarding the rules, of course, and that is that if we return to what is essentially a power-based system, then the most powerful actors still get all the things that they want, and the least powerful actors still do not. And so this piece, and I was speaking with a collaborator of ours, a friend of ours who works for a civil society organization in Bangladesh just last week, and she mentioned that for her and for her country, sort of a withdrawal from commitment to the multilateral trading system is really terrifying, is really frightening. Because when they have to negotiate all their deals bilaterally, they lose the level of bargaining power that you get in a one country, one vote multilateral system. And so I just want to voice that concern and voice that worry of, if we do result, and I think Professor Wouters earlier said that the idea of returning to a spaghetti bowl of no multilateral collaboration is a real concern. Now, I don't know if I would go all the way to nightmare, but I would say it is a real concern. And yet a lot of the proposals that I see coming from the global north especially, and is this idea, well, we can't get a multilateral agreement, so we should go plurilateral. We should go in small groups, coalitions of the willing, I think that phrase was used, and it comes up a lot. And I worry that if we focus on building coalitions of the willing, we'll end up with coalitions of the wealthy and capable, and not really the coalitions of the countries that need that need collaboration. And so I think that's probably where I'm going to stop, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. We have maybe time to pick one question, and then enough time to mingle later on and to stay here. Is there anybody wishing to pose a question? Or you are all, I cannot say exhausted, but I would say satisfied with what you have received from not just this panel, but are you going? No? No, so sorry. Anybody? I see one.
There's a woman to your right.
With all due regard, I'm a student at Boston University pursuing Masters in International Affairs. I have a question regarding unemployment. In my class with Professor Gallagher, we read that the few of the restrictions, how the restrictions are going to have impact over trade and deficits and surplus. My question is, when we read about employment, we realized that in the trade sector, in the sector where the trade is maximum, there's going to be heavy unemployment, which is not going to be, the government is not going to meet that kind of unemployment issue. It's not going to be able to fulfill in coming time. And they're going to go into non-trade sectors or completely go out of job or have wage decline. How do you think it's going to impact on those things? Is it going to make it worse? Will the government be able to mitigate those kind of issues? Does tariff policies, trade policies, are able to address regional and local unemployment in sectors that are non-trade or trade?
I mean, I can say, I think I got it. I mean, so when we worked on trade adjustment assistance, we did a lot of research to understand different localities across the country and how they implement it, how they add on other programs and resources to it. I mean, we talked to people impacted. There are cities that have few, but there are some places that have been able to use the federal trade adjustment assistance and add on to it and make it really comprehensive for people impacted, but there's very few. And so it's a hard one. It's hard. It's true that TAA isn't enough for people who lose their jobs, who've spent decades working in factories. I mean, and it is heartbreaking to hear people talk about the fear and the obstacles that they face and their children and their families, right? With how they're going to find a way to survive and support themselves. But there are models in certain places, places like Portland. You know, there are places where local communities have found ways to add on to the federal programs and make it more effective. And while it's not enough, it still offers some training support, some job placement assistance that when you don't have other options, it becomes really even more important. But I think it also offers, like, the whole debate over trade adjustment assistance really, I mean, it really just, it's an opportunity for people to open your eyes to the kinds of struggles people are having. I mean, I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and so it's really, it's nice to be back in Massachusetts and a place that produced more copper wire than I think anywhere else in the world. Before I was born, my dad was a steel worker, my mom was a teacher, right? Like, I saw the impacts of a lot of industry shutting down and leaving. I saw the results of it to my community. And I just think it's one of those points for us to really think creatively and grapple with, like, what is the need and what are new ways that we can come up with to try to support each other. And that's one thing I've learned coming into the trade space is just it's really about, you know, collectively trying to figure out what can we do together to try to bring each other up and support each other. At least that's what I've learned from folks in this space.
Anybody else?
I guess one thing on full employment is that nobody mentioned the International Trade Organization or the Havana Charter, which I think is important important for all of us to learn a little bit of the history on this, because as Ambassador Tai said, the Bretton Woods institutions were founded where full employment was like the major goal right? The U.S. was trying to do, well, all the negotiators were worried about two things. They did not want another Hitler, and they did not want another depression. And those were the two overriding things to try to create this, a new world economic order. And to their credit, especially relative to these days, I think 6 weeks in New Hampshire, they created a flexible gold standard. They created the International Monetary Fund. They created the World Bank. And they tried to do something on trade as well. But heck, in 6 weeks, they couldn't do it all. Right now, in 6 weeks, you can't even do a one-page communique. So we can't knock them for it. So the trade conversation carried on, and there was something called the Havana Charter that was going to create something called the International Trade Organization, where full employment was core as one of the core principles of it. But by then, Roosevelt had passed away. Truman had become president, and he, I'm forgetting his name. The trade guy who Doug Irwin loves, the Secretary of State, not Atchison, not Dulles. Oh my gosh, the free trader who during Roosevelt fought with Morgenthau the whole time. What's that? No, I can't remember his name. So Truman wasn't so excited about it, and the U.S. Congress really pushed back. And it wasn't until it wasn't until 1995 that we created this and created the World Trade Organization, and countries in the Global South, when those conversations started, wanted to have full employment be part of it, but you won't find that in the chapeau of the WTO, because it was the Clinton administration and the Bush administration behind them. Those are the two that really played the key role in negotiating. Did not want to have that be as a center, and it's fallen by the wayside. And so I think there's lots of history for us all to learn here, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, that we actually lived in an era where we tried to put markets as a key. I'm an economist, and so I do believe that markets are the best way to allocate resources, but to get us to certain goals, not be goals in and of themselves. And now, unfortunately, we have a lot more things to worry about than just full employment. You need to, just having a job in Boston, as Mayor Woosh will tell us, you can't afford to live here, right? Just having a job at Home Depot, Walmart, or Amazon. And so we need full employment at living wages, and we also need a healthy planet, which has been completely divorced from the trading system. So we have a lot of work to do, but we've had a great conversation over the past 5 hours, I guess. And we've got a bunch of great stuff to talk about and to work on. And it's inspiring to see students come here and talk about this, because we've got a lot of work to do. And I know not all of our students are from the U.S. You've got a lot of work to do in your countries too, because often the same kind of thing happens, where those who gain the most end up in office, and they want to keep that. And so we have a lot of work to do.
Okay, thank you. I think we are now at a point to conclude our conference today. I would like to thank all distinguished guests, all of them, not just those who are now sitting with me. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for your insightful comments, remarks, and thank you, you guys in the audience, for having been with us this afternoon / this evening. Stay tuned. The center organizes and hosts a number of interesting events. One is coming up, part of this Centering Europe series. It's next Monday. Stay tuned, and please attend our meetings. Thank you so much once again.